June 15th, 1945, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. In a dark wooden barracks, a young German woman clutched her newborn, shaking with fear as heavy boots pounded closer. The door burst open, hinges screaming, and 2 American guards stepped in, faces hard in the yellow light. All her life she had been told, "The Americans will steal your children. They will use them. They will erase them." Her wool blankets scratched her arms, her thin gown was wet with milk and sweat, and her baby's weak cry cut through the smell of soap and fear. When the soldiers reached for the child, she let out a scream in German that didn't sound human at all. What she did not know was this: the men she feared most were about to save her baby's life. Stay with me as we follow her true story inside an American POW camp and see how it destroyed everything she thought she knew. If you want more untold World War II stories like this, please subscribe, hit like, and watch until the end to support this channel. Spring 1945. After days inside a dark, shaking train, the doors slid open with a hard metal scrape. Heat rushed in like a wall. The German women blinked in the bright Louisiana sun, stepping down one by one onto red clay dust. Margaret Wolfe was 23, in a faded grey Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform that hung loose on her thin body. Under the cloth of her jacket 4 months along, a child grew that no one here knew about. The father, a Luftwaffe pilot named Karl, was already dead. She had crossed half a world as a prisoner. First, the air raid sirens and bombs over German cities. Then the long train west, past shattered stations and burned fields. Then the ship across the Atlantic, the smell of salt and diesel and fear. Now, enemy soil. For years, Nazi radio had warned her about this place. Americans, she had been told, beat German prisoners, starved them, used them in experiments. Better to die than fall into their hands, some officers had said. As she stepped down, her legs shaking, she waited for shouting, for rifle butts, for dogs. Instead, the first thing that hit her was the smell. The air was thick and wet, heavy with pine sap, and something sweet she did not know yet, magnolia. From a low wooden building nearby came another smell, shocking in its richness, hot fat, roasting meat, coffee. Her empty stomach twisted so hard she almost bent double. Across the United States, more than 400,000 German prisoners would be held in over 500 camps by the end of the war. Camp Ruston was just one of them. Rows of unpainted wooden barracks, wire fences, watchtowers, and gravel paths neatly swept. To Margaret, it looked wrong in a way she could not name. Where were the snarling guards, the barbed wire crowned with skulls and warning signs from the posters? Here, the towers were manned, but the rifles pointed down. Guards walked slowly, caps pushed back, talking in easy English. Somewhere, a radio played brassy jazz that made no sense to her ears. "This is a prison?" one woman muttered in German beside her. "It looks like a farm." The women were formed into a column and marched toward the mess hall. Their boots crunched on gravel. Sweat ran down their backs inside wool uniforms built for European winters, not the American South. Above them, the sky was a hard, endless blue. As they neared the mess hall, the smells grew stronger. Fried chicken, flour and fat for biscuits, real coffee. Inside, metal trays clattered, voices rose in a low roar. Margaret could smell salt and pepper, onions cooking, something sweet like apples. "They are trying to trick us," whispered an older prisoner, a former party member from Hamburg. "Food like this cannot be real. It is a trap." Later, she would remember that sentence, word for word. Margaret wanted to believe her. It was easier to cling to fear than to accept that the enemy was feeding them better than their own cities now could. In Hamburg, her cousin had written, people boiled turnip peels for soup. Here, she saw plates piled with meat. When her turn came, she slid her tray forward with shaking hands. A tall black American in a stained white apron smiled at her as if she were any other hungry person and dropped a piece of golden chicken onto her plate. Mashed potatoes followed, then bright green beans, a slice of soft white bread, a glass of cold milk that beaded with condensation in the heat. The paradox was almost too much to hold. She had arrived expecting beatings and crusts of bread, and instead the first American to speak to her wordlessly gave her more food than she had seen in months. She sat at a long table under buzzing electric lights. The room smelled of grease, soap, and human bodies. Around her, some women ate in silence, tears running down their faces. One crammed food in so fast that she had to run outside, retching, her starved body unable to handle richness. "Remember who they are," another woman hissed. "This is not kindness. This is a weapon." Margaret raised the chicken to her lips. The skin cracked between her teeth. Hot fat and salt filled her mouth. For a moment she forgot the train, the ship, the guards. All she knew was that her body was suddenly warm from the inside. Then her hand went, by habit, to her belly. 2 heartbeats now, not 1. After the meal, the column moved again, this time toward a low, white building. Inside, the air was cool and smelled sharply of disinfectant. Bright electric bulbs hummed overhead. To Margaret, used to dim German flats and blackout curtains, it seemed like a hospital from another world. One by one, the women stepped forward to give their names, ages, and ranks to a clerk and a translator. An American nurse in a stiff white uniform, lipstick a bright red slash on her pale face, waited with a clipboard. When Margaret's turn came, the nurse's eyes met hers for a second. There was no hate in them, only tired focus. Margaret stated her name, Margaret Wolf, her rank as a communications helper, her age. The translator, a German-American soldier, repeated each detail in English. Then came the physical exam. The nurse pressed a cold stethoscope to Margaret's back, checked her eyes, her throat, her teeth, worn down by years of poor food. At last the nurse's hand rested just for a moment on Margaret's abdomen. Margaret froze. If they found out she was pregnant, what would they do? Separate her, punish her, take the child? The nurse paused, frowned slightly, and made a note on her paper. She did not say a word. Outside, beyond the white walls, the camp settled into its evening rhythm. Boots on gravel, a bugle in the distance, the low hum of voices. Inside, one life, and one life not yet born, waited to see how the enemy would choose to act. What they did next would surprise her even more than the first hot meal. The nurse's hand left Margaret's stomach and reached for the clipboard. She spoke a few quick words in English. The German-American translator listened, then turned to Margaret. "You are pregnant," he said in slow German. "About 4 months. You will get extra food. The doctor will see you every week." Margaret stared at him. For a heartbeat she did not understand. In her mind, discovery of the baby meant punishment, maybe even losing the child. But here it was, written like a simple note. Name, age, pregnant. No anger, no threat. Across America, the army had orders to feed prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. Many camps gave German POWs around 3,000 calories a day, more than many people in bombed German cities were now getting. To Margaret, who had lived for months on thin soup and bread mixed with sawdust, those numbers had no meaning. Only the weight of hot food in her stomach did. She was led with the other women to their barracks. Inside, rows of metal bunk beds lined both walls. Each had a thin mattress, 2 wool blankets, and a flat pillow. The room smelled of old wood, dust, and the faint, clean sting of soap. At the far end were washrooms with real toilets and showers. When Margaret turned the tap, water gushed out, first cold, then slowly warming. Steam rose into the air. That night, as she lay on a lower bunk near the corner, she slipped a hand to her belly. The fabric of her uniform felt rough under her fingers. "You will eat," she whispered in German, though no one was listening. "You will not starve like my aunt." Days settled into a pattern. A bell rang at 6 each morning. Boots hit the floor, blankets folded, a roll call in the cool dawn air. The guards counted heads with clipboards, not with rifles. Then breakfast, oatmeal, bread, sometimes scrambled eggs. The mess hall always hummed with voices, tin cups clinking, chairs scraping the floor. Margaret was given light work in the camp laundry. The heat inside the wooden building wrapped around her like a wet cloth. Steam rose from big metal tubs. American uniforms in olive green and khaki slid through her hands, heavy when wet, stiff when dry. The smell of soap flakes and damp cotton filled her nose. On paper, she was working for the enemy, washing the clothes of the men who had defeated her country. In reality, each day of work earned her small coloured tokens, camp money she could use at the canteen. There she could buy things that had vanished from German shops years ago. Chocolate, cigarettes, soap, even simple magazines in English she could not read, but still held like proof of another life. As the weeks passed, her belly began to show. Some women whispered at first, then spoke more openly. "You should have said no," one older woman from Bremen told her in the yard. To bring a child into this, it is selfish. Others were softer. A former nurse from Cologne quietly slid half her bread across the table one evening.
"Eat it," she said. "The baby needs it more than I do." Every few days, the American nurse appeared again. Her name, Margaret learned from the translator, was Dorothy. In the small exam room, Dorothy wrapped a tape around Margaret's growing waist, pressed a metal tube to her skin to listen for the quick beat of the baby's heart, checked her blood pressure with a rubber cuff that hissed with air. "Any pain?" the translator would ask in German. "Only in my back," Margaret would. "Are you eating enough?" "Yes," always, though guilt often made each bite feel heavy. Dorothy almost never smiled at her, but she was careful. Her hands were clean, her touch steady. To Margaret, it was another strange contrast. A woman who might have lost friends to German bombs now checking carefully on a German prisoner's unborn child. In July, a letter arrived. Mail for prisoners came through slow channels, opened and stamped by censors on both sides. The paper in Margaret's hands was thin, almost see-through. The writing, her cousin's, shook across the page. "Hamburg is ruins," another cousin wrote. "Our street is gone. Your mother's building was hit. We think she is dead. Aunt Greta died in February. The doctor said starvation, but there are hardly doctors anymore. Children beg in the streets. Some say the Americans feed their prisoners like kings. Others say they torture them. If you live and if you can, send food. We are hungry all the time." Margaret read the letter again and again. That evening, the camp served pork chops, potatoes, green beans, and a small square of apple pie. The meat was tender. The pie smelled of cinnamon and sugar. She put each forkful in her mouth as if it might turn to ash. Later, she went to the canteen and filled a small box with crackers, chocolate, a tin of condensed milk, thinking of her cousin and the children in Hamburg. At the mail desk, a sergeant shook his head. "No food to Germany," the translator explained. "Regulations, security." So all she could send was a short reply saying that she was not beaten, that there was enough to eat. She did not write about the pie. One afternoon near the laundry, a young American guard with sandy hair and a boyish face watched her pass. He said something quickly in English, smiling and nodding toward her stomach. The translator, walking nearby, stopped. "He says his sister just had a baby," explained. "He asks if you need anything." Margaret stiffened. "What could I need from?" she said. A week later, the same guard came up again. His name, she learned, was Jimmy, from a farm in Iowa. In his hand, he held a small wooden object, sanded smooth. "For your baby?" the translator said simply. It was a rattle, carved from light-colored wood. When she shook it, it clicked softly. The grain felt warm and fine under her fingers. No one in the barracks had given her anything for the child.
Now here was an enemy soldier offering a handmade gift. That night, under the creak of beds and the soft breathing of 50 women, Margaret lay awake, the rattle hidden under her blanket. Outside, crickets sang in the grass. A guard's footsteps crunched on the gravel path. She thought of her cousin's words, starvation, ruins, hunger, and of this place where the enemy fed her and made toys for her unborn child. This was not propaganda, it was reality, and it left her with more questions than answers. As summer deepened and her belly grew heavy, those questions would only multiply. By late summer, Margaret moved slowly. Her ankles were swollen, her back ached, and the Louisiana air felt like a hot, wet cloth pressed over her face. Even simple tasks in the laundry left her breathless. Camp Ruston held more than 4,000 German prisoners at its height, nearly all of them thousands of kilometers from home. Yet many days it felt to Margaret like a small village, the same paths, the same faces, the same sounds of buckets, boots, and distant radios. In the evenings, when work was over and the heat eased a little, she liked to sit on the low steps outside the barracks. The wooden boards were rough under her hands, the smell of pine trees mixed with cigarette smoke as women gathered in small knots, talking quietly. Sometimes American soldiers played baseball on a field beyond the wire. The crack of the bat, the shouts of English words she did not know, and the thud of feet on dry ground drifted across the fence. The scene felt almost like a holiday to her, but it took place inside a camp built for enemies. "They look like boys," said Lotta, a young woman from Munich, one evening as they watched. "They laugh as if there is no war." "They came late and took the victory," answered the older woman from Hamburg sharply. "Do not forget that." Margaret watched one soldier, maybe 19, slide in the dust and jump up grinning. He brushed the dirt from his uniform, called to his teammates, and for a second she saw not a conqueror, but someone's son. The paradox grew clearer each week. Germany had promised strength and honor, yet her cousin now wrote of ruins and hunger. America had been painted as cruel and weak, yet here its guards tossed balls, served hot food, and checked on prisoner babies. At night, the bunks creaked as women shifted, unable to sleep in the heat. Whispers rose through the dark. "It is a trick," said the former party member more than once. "They make us soft. They make us forget. Then they will show their true face." Lotta's voice would answer from the shadows. "Their true face is 3 meals a day and medicine. Our cities are rubble. Which truth do you like better?" Arguments like this never had clear winners. Voices grew tight, then fell silent. Only the crickets outside and the soft snore of exhausted women remained. One night, Margaret lay awake listening to the guard's slow steps outside, gravel crunching under his boots. Her back throbbed. The child inside her rolled and kicked, a strong, insistent motion under her ribs. She stared up at the dark ceiling. She remembered how, 3 years earlier, she had sat in a Berlin classroom reading poetry. Her biggest worry had been passing an exam. When she joined the Wehrmacht auxiliaries, she had believed the radio speeches, that Germany was threatened on all sides, that the Führer was saving them, that enemies were monsters who would burn German children alive. Now, in a camp surrounded by those same monsters, she had more food, more medical care, and more safety than her cousin in Hamburg. This was not propaganda, but it was reality, and it did not fit the stories she had trusted. One afternoon in September, as the heat pressed down and the laundry building dripped with steam, a sharp pain cut across her stomach. At first, she thought it was just another ache. Then it came again, harder. Her hand grabbed the edge of the table. The smell of hot soap and wet cloth grew strange and far away. "Are you all right?" the woman beside her asked. I don't know," Margaret said, her breath short. The supervisor called the guards. They brought a stretcher, the canvas rough under her fingers as they lifted her. The sky above her was bright white, making her squint as they carried her across the yard to the infirmary. Inside, the air was cool, the floor smooth under their boots. Dorothy appeared quickly, hair pinned back, white uniform crisp even in the long day. She checked Margaret's pulse, her belly, the timing of the pains. The rubber cuff around Margaret's arm squeezed tight, then hissed as it released. After a while, Dorothy shook her head and spoke to the translator. "It is not the real labor yet," he said gently. "False pains. Your body is getting ready, but not today." They gave her water and something mild for the pain, then helped her to a small bed in a side room. Dorothy did not leave right away. She sat on the edge of the bed for nearly an hour, saying little, just being there. "Why do you stay?" Margaret asked at last, in slow German, knowing Dorothy might not understand. Dorothy looked at her, then at the curve of her stomach. She reached out and just for a second squeezed Margaret's hand. No words, only that firm, warm grip. Later, one former nurse from the German side would recall in her own memoir, "It was the first time I saw an American touch a German prisoner without anger. That small touch did more to end the war in my head than all the speeches." The pains faded. Margaret returned to the barracks, tired and shaken, but with a new awareness. The woman she had been told would hate her had held her hand in the dark. In the weeks that followed, the false pains came and went. Each time, they left her a little more worn, a little more aware that the real birth was getting close. The baby kicked stronger now, as if impatient. Her world shrank to the narrow space between barracks, mess hall, infirmary, and the distant sound of bats hitting balls in the evening. Some nights, she lay awake and tried to imagine the moment the child would arrive. Would the Americans take him? Would they raise him here? Would he ever see Germany? She had no answers, only the slow swing of the ceiling shadows and the hum of insects outside. The war of bombs and bullets was over for her, but inside her mind, the war of beliefs and fears still raged. It would take one long, painful night in October to decide which side would win. The real labor started before dawn. On 12th of October 1945, sometime after 3 a.m, a sharp pain cut through Margaret's body like a knife. She woke with a gasp, clutching the edge of her bunk. Around her, the barracks was dark, full of the soft breathing of sleeping women and the faint buzz of insects outside. The pain came again, stronger, rolling from her back to her belly. Sweat broke out on her forehead. This was not the dull ache she had felt before. This felt like her body was being pulled apart. "Help," she whispered at first, then louder. "Help me, please." Blankets rustled. Someone lit a small lamp, throwing yellow light up onto the wooden ceiling. "It's time," said the nurse from Cologne, eyes wide. "Call the guards, now!" Boots pounded on the gravel outside, then on the wooden floor of the barracks. The door squealed open. 2 American guards stepped in, faces serious, rifles slung harmlessly on their shoulders. Behind them came Dorothy in her white uniform, hair hastily tied back, eyes sharp even at this hour. She checked Margaret quickly with practiced hands, then nodded once to the guards. A stretcher appeared. The canvas felt rough under Margaret's fingers as they lifted her. Pain gripped her again as they carried her out, but something else pressed on her mind too, the sky. Above her, as they moved between the low buildings, the stars were bright and close. The Milky Way stretched like a pale cloud over Camp Ruston. The air smelled of damp earth, pine, and a faint sweetness of honeysuckle. Somewhere a dog barked, somewhere a guard coughed. "My child," she thought, biting back a cry as another contraction came, "will be born under enemy stars." Inside the infirmary, the world changed. The floors were smooth and cool. Bright electric lamps washed the small delivery room in hard white light. Metal instruments gleamed on a tray. A narrow bed stood ready, covered in crisp white sheets that smelled strongly of soap and disinfectant. An older American doctor with grey hair stepped forward. He spoke English. Margaret couldn't follow, but his tone was calm. He nodded to her, to Dorothy, to another nurse. Hands moved around her with quick, sure motions. Across the United States, by the end of 1945, the Army Medical Department was responsible for the health of more than 370,000 German prisoners. Most would never need more than bandages and basic care. A small number, like Margaret, would need something far more intimate, help bringing a new life into the world. The hours that followed blurred into a rhythm of pain and effort. Contraction, breathing, brief rest, contraction again. Dorothy wiped Margaret's forehead with a cool, damp cloth. The other nurse checked the sheets, the instruments, the clock on the wall. "Almost there," Dorothy said softly in English, voice low and steady, even if Margaret could not pick out every word. "You can do this." Between waves of pain, Margaret's mind flashed back to stories from home. Women giving birth in basements during air raids, babies delivered by candlelight in cellars while bombs fell overhead. Here, there were no bombs, no dust, no crumbling plaster, only light, clean tools and strangers who were doing everything they could to keep her and the child alive. "This is the enemy," she thought, gripping the metal rail of the bed as another contraction tore through her. "Feeding us, washing us, helping our children be born." After nearly 7 hours, the room changed. The doctor's voice grew more urgent. Nurses moved faster. The pressure inside her body grew until she thought she would break. "Push," the German-American translator said, appearing at her side now, repeating the doctor's command in her own language. "One more, you are very close." She pushed with everything she had left. The world narrowed to a single point of effort, then suddenly released. For a heartbeat there was only silence. Then a thin, sharp cry pierced the room. The doctor said something with a small smile. The translator leaned close. "A boy," he said. "You have a son." They lifted the baby, small and wet and red, and laid him on her chest. His skin was warm and slippery. His tiny ribs moved fast with each breath. His hands opened and closed, fingers splayed as if grabbing at the air. Margaret stared. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a little mouth that opened in a soft, outraged wail. Dark, damp hair plastered to his head. He smelled of blood and soap and something new and clean that she could only call life. Later, she would say, in that moment, the camp, the war, everything disappeared. There was only this child, and the hands that put him on my chest were American hands. She held him as close as the wires and cloth allowed, feeling his small heart beating against her own. Tears ran down her face. For the first time in years, they were not from fear. The translator asked, "What name will you give him?" She thought of her own father, Klaus, killed in 1940. She thought of Karl, the Luftwaffe pilot, who had been the baby's father, whose second name had been Wolfgang. "Klaus Wolfgang," she said. "His name is Klaus Wolfgang." The translator wrote it carefully in the camp records. Klaus Wolfgang Wolf, born 12th of October, 1945, Camp Ruston, Louisiana, German citizen, son of a prisoner of war. For 3 days, Margaret stayed in a small recovery room. The bed was softer than the bunk in the barracks. Clean sheets were changed often. She received extra bowls of soup, bread, fruit when there was some, and always milk. Dorothy and the other nurses showed her how to hold Klaus for feeding, how to wash him, how to wrap him snug in a thin blanket so he felt safe. I had not seen such order and cleanliness in years, another woman, who gave birth in a POW camp, later remembered. It was like a hospital from before the war dropped into our prison. Outside, the camp moved in its usual rhythm, counts, meals, work details. Inside that white room, for a brief time, Margaret's world shrank to the weight of a tiny body in her arms and the soft sound of his breathing. But the outside world was never far. On the evening of the third day, the door opened again. Dorothy stepped in, not alone this time, but with 2 guards and the translator. Margaret's arms tightened around Klaus. The war in her mind, quiet for a little while, suddenly woke up again. Dorothy stood just inside the door, her white uniform bright against the dull walls. The 2 guards waited behind her. The translator looked uncomfortable. Margaret felt her heart jump. She pulled Klaus closer. His small body was warm against her chest. She could feel the weight of him through the thin blanket. Dorothy spoke first, in quick English. Then she nodded to the translator. "She says," he began slowly, "the baby should sleep in the nursery tonight. You must rest. The nurses will watch him. In the morning, they will bring him back to you." For a second, the words did not sink in. Then they hit her all at once. "No," Margaret said. Her voice came out rough. "No, he stays with me. It is better for him." The translator tried again. "The nursery is warm. There is special equipment. You are still weak." He took a small breath, as if choosing his words. "It is only for the night." All the old stories rushed back into her head. Americans stealing German children, experiments, orphanages, re-education. She had no proof any of that was real, but fear did not need proof. "You will not take my child," she said, louder now. "He is mine. He stays." Dorothy took 1 step closer. She spoke again, her voice calm but firm. The guards did not move, but their hands rested ready on the stretcher they had brought. Around them, other women had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. The room smelled of soap and milk and human sweat. Klaus began to fuss, catching the tension in the air. His thin cry rose up. "Please," Margaret said, switching to German completely now. "Bitte! Not my baby! You have everything! You have won! Leave me this!" The translator looked at Dorothy helplessly. She said 1 short line in English. His shoulders dropped. "I am sorry," he told Margaret. "It is the rule. For the first week, the babies sleep in the nursery at night. It is for their health." When the guards stepped forward, she screamed. Later, another prisoner would write in her diary, "I had heard many terrible sounds during the war. That scream was the worst. It was the sound of a mother who believed she would never see her child again." The guards did not shout or hit. They moved slowly, speaking soft English words Margaret could not understand. But they were strong, and she was weak from birth and 3 nights with little sleep. They pried her hands away from the blanket. Klaus's cry rose higher. Margaret lunged forward, almost falling from the bed. Her arms reached out, empty. Tears blurred her vision. The room spun. "Give him back!" she shouted. "Please, please!" The guards carried Klaus out, his small wails fading down the hall. The door closed with a dull click. The smell of milk and baby soap lingered in the air, but he was gone. All at once, her legs lost their strength. She sank back onto the bed and sobbed into her hands. The sound seemed to come from somewhere, deep inside her chest. No bomb, no prison camp, no hunger had broken her like this simple act. Dorothy stayed for a while, saying something in English that the translator tried to turn into comfort. "They will bring him back," he said. "In the morning. They are not hurting him." Margaret did not believe him. How could she? Everything she had been taught said the enemy would take what was most precious. This seemed to prove it. When they left, the room felt huge and empty. Her arms ached with the memory of Klaus's weight. Her breasts throbbed, full of milk with nowhere to go. The ticking of a small clock on the wall sounded too loud. Outside, the camp followed its night rhythm. Boots on gravel, a distant truck engine, the low murmur of guards talking. Inside, she lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling. Every sound from the hall made her heart jolt, but no one came. She imagined her son alone in a cold room, crying until his voice was hoarse. She imagined strangers' hands on him. She imagined doors closing forever. In some bombed German cities by 1945, 1 in 10 babies died before their first birthday. Infection, hunger, cold. There were many ways to lose a child. In the United States, even during war, the number was closer to 3 in 100. Margaret did not know these statistics. She only knew fear. At last, dawn lightened the window. Grey turned slowly to pale gold. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. The handle turned. Dorothy stepped in, and in her arms was a small, white bundle. Klaus's face was red from crying. His fists waved weakly in the air. Margaret sat up so fast the room spun. "Klaus," she whispered, "is that—" Dorothy smiled just a little and placed the baby carefully in her arms. His smell hit her at once. Milk, powder, that warm, sweet scent of newborn skin. He quieted almost at once, pressing his face into her. He cried most of the night, the translator said. They could not calm him. He wanted his mother. Margaret checked him quickly, her hands shaking. 10 fingers, 10 toes, the same small birthmark on his arm. No marks, no bruises. His diaper was clean. He was warm. He was alive. The relief was so strong it hurt. Tears ran down her cheeks again, but they felt different this time. Later that morning, Dorothy took her to see the nursery. It was a small, bright room in a nearby building, painted white with yellow curtains that let in the sun. 6 metal cribs stood in a neat row, each with a thin mattress and clean sheet. Only one crib was in use. A card was tied to the rail of that crib. In careful letters it read, Klaus Wolfgang Wolf, 12th October, 1945. He has outgrown it. The bear smelled faintly of dust and some American home far away. Klaus's fingers latched onto its fur at once. By early 1946, the war was long over. Across the ocean, Europe lay in ruins. In Germany, more than 60 cities had been heavily damaged or destroyed. Food production had fallen sharply. In some areas, civilians lived on fewer than 1/500 calories a day. In the United States, by contrast, factories still turned out canned meat, flour, and powdered milk in huge numbers. Orders came at last. Many prisoners at Camp Ruston would be sent home. Ships waited at American ports to carry them across the Atlantic. By then, more than 370,000 German POWs had passed through camps in the United States. Most, like Margaret, would never forget them. The day they left, Klaus was a few months old. The morning was cool. Mist hung low over the red clay as the women lined up with their few belongings. Margaret held Klaus in one arm, a small bundle of clothes and the wooden rattle in the other. The stuffed bear was tied to her bag with a piece of string. As they marched out, past the towers and the wire, the camp smelled of damp earth, coal smoke from the kitchen, and the sharp, clean scent of pine. Guards stood at intervals, watching quietly. Some raised their hands in brief waves. The Americans had the chance to be cruel, Margaret would tell Klaus years later. They were not. They fed us when our own people were starving. They helped you be born. Remember that. Germany was another world. When the ship docked and the prisoners were unloaded, their feet stepped onto broken pavement. Buildings stood like broken teeth against a grey sky. The air smelled of coal smoke, damp plaster, and in some places rot. Rubble crunched under their boots as they walked through the remains of old streets. Windows were boarded up. People moved like shadows, thin faces turned away. Ration cards, not camp tokens, now decided who ate and who went hungry. In that ruined country, stories began to spread. Former prisoners spoke quietly of what they had seen in American camps: hot meals, fair treatment, nurseries for POW babies. One historian later wrote, "For many German men and women, their time as prisoners in the West was the first time they saw democracy not as a slogan, but as food on a plate, medicine in a bottle, and respect given even to enemies." Margaret was one of those voices. When Klaus was old enough to understand, she told him the story of his birth. She spoke of the long train rides, the heat of Louisiana, the smell of fried chicken, the clean white nursery, the night they took him away, and the morning they brought him back. "Do not believe every poster, every speech," she told him. "I did. I was wrong. The enemy can be cruel, but they can also be kind, and our own leaders can lie." Years later, Klaus would say, "I grew up knowing that the word enemy was too simple. My mother's stories were my first lesson in that." Across West Germany, many former POWs told similar stories. They had marched out as soldiers of a conquering army, full of orders and slogans. They returned with another picture in their heads: American guards who shared photographs of their farms, black cooks who piled plates with food, nurses who held the hands of enemy women in labor. They had come as conquerors, they left as students. The paradox that shaped Margaret's life also touched nations. The United States had fought with tanks, bombs, and ships, but it also fought, quietly, with full warehouses, fair camp rules, and the decision to treat prisoners as humans instead of tools. In that quiet war after the war, the victory was slower, but it reached deeper. It moved not on maps, but in minds. Margaret's scream in the infirmary at Camp Ruston began as a cry of war. In her mind, Americans were the monsters from posters and radio speeches, and the soldiers lifting Klaus from schedule, feeding times, changing times, temperature checks. To see all this, one former POW mother later said, "When at home we had nothing, it broke my heart. Our own children in Germany had less than the children of our prisoners." Historians now believe that hundreds of babies were born to German prisoners in North America. Most of them, like Klaus, were cared for in small nurseries like this, with regular weighing, feeding, and checks by trained staff. Margaret stood in that warm room, hearing the quiet tick of a wall clock and the distant hum of camp life outside. She thought of her cousin's letter about children begging in the ruins of Hamburg. Then she looked at the supplies lined up for enemy babies. The old story in her head, that Americans were monsters, began to crumble in a new way. It was not only that they were not cruel, it was that they were looking after her son better than her own destroyed country now could. That truth would follow her long after she left Camp Ruston. But for now, all that mattered was that tonight, when darkness came again, she would know where Klaus was sleeping and why. The next days would turn her from a frightened prisoner into something else, a witness. For the rest of that first week, the days and nights followed a new pattern. In the morning, a nurse brought Klaus from the nursery to Margaret's arms. All day he stayed with her in the small recovery room, warm against her chest, his tiny fingers clutching at her gown. At night, he went back to the bright, ordered nursery. Each time the door closed behind him, her heart still tightened. But now fear was mixed with something else, the memory of clean sheets, full bottles, and the card with his name on the crib. Slowly, against every story she had heard, trust began to grow. After 7 nights, Dorothy came in carrying Klaus as usual. The translator followed, holding a small paper. "The doctor says he is strong now," he told Margaret. "He can sleep with you in the barracks. You will bring him here twice a week, so we can check him." Margaret held Klaus closer, breathing in the soft, milky smell of his hair. "Thank you," she said in careful English, the words strange on her tongue. Dorothy gave a short nod, and for the first time, a clear smile. Back in the women's barracks, space was made for them. Someone found a wooden box that could serve as a crib. Another woman sewed a small cloth to pad it. At night, Klaus cried and woke everyone, his thin cries cutting through the darkness. Some women complained, others got up and walked him, humming old German lullabies. "He became all of our baby," one prisoner later remembered. "He was proof that life could still begin, even when we thought everything had ended." Jimmy, the young guard from Iowa, often passed by the window. He would make faces at Klaus, who kicked his legs in answer. One day, Jimmy brought a small, stuffed bear, worn at the ears. "From my nephew," the translator explained. "He has outgrown it." The bear smelled faintly of dust.